Chapter 1. For Betu, everything had ended. Just beyond those rocky walls, the storm's intensity paled next to his determination, or his resignation, an attribute the storm did not seem to share. Perhaps it did, unrelenting as it had been for the past few centuries. Maybe it was resigned to its fate. Maybe that was why, after so long, it had never moved from the top of this rocky plateau. Somewhere along that mesa's treacherous height, in a crevice spared by the thundering erosion, Betu shivered. He had not stopped climbing out of resignation. No, he was just tired. He had now been many, many days on this journey, not caring how it ended or whether it did. As far as he was concerned, everything had ended. His son sacrificed, his wife dead of grief soon after, and him, both of them, even while she wept and gasped away from this life, frowned upon for daring to question the old ways. So he had left the settlement because there was no reason to stay, and he had come here because it might kill him. Or perhaps he might find a deity and inquire after his wife and son. He scoffed. In his current frame of mind, any deity was as likely to get a question as to get attacked by him. Now that was a thought. The idea that he might instead kill a storm with his knife of bone. Betu allowed himself a small, bitter laugh, which soon turned into sobbing. The storm raged on. It never seemed to pick up or slow down. People told stories of how the winds protected it rather than gave it life. And the phenomenon was so highly, unnaturally localized that, naturally, it evoked superstition and fear. All avoided the region, the wild, the wise, and the foolhardy. Betu was no fool. He hadn't planned to come here. The instinct blossomed after he began his wandering. Specifically, after the night he had stopped at a campfire, a waypoint set up and used by the many trade caravans to travel between his old home and Kadia, a collection of larger stone-walled cities to the south. At the campfire, 4 merchants sat without guards, as they so often did in this sparse region. The air was thick with the smell of cooking and other recreational burnings, implying they were done eating. One of them, portlier than the rest, leaned against his backrest, picking at his teeth with something. Along with 2 others, he seemed to be listening intently to the 4th. The lattermost story trailed off as he, then they all, caught sight of the wandering Betu. Earlier in his life, Betu might have been enchanted, excited even, to meet such traveled company. But on that night, he was still consumed with grief, with the loss of everything still so recent. And so he had gestured just enough to make his intentions known to the small gathering. Some food, some water, some time to rest, then I will leave you alone. The 4 well-traveled merchants by the fire had read many stories on many faces. They knew his sadness and did not need to know its cause. So they obliged, offering him a space to sit and rest. They gave him some food and, kindest of all, sympathetically turned their backs on him and their bejeweled attentions once more towards each other. Anyway, storyteller continued, that was the last time I went that far north. The one who had been picking his teeth grunted. It might have been laughter. Well, what would you have done? The storyteller challenged. Tried to sell him some rugs, the portly one responded. And when that failed, as I expect it would, I would have continued back to Kadia. Of all the impossible things I have heard tonight, a long-faced merchant scoffed, the most impossible is that you, Alaki, he gestured at the portly one, would pass up such an adventure. Alaki, the portly, grunted again. All smoked in silence for a while. Betu ate quietly in their shadow. The most interesting thing, Longface puffed pleasantly on his pipe. The most interesting thing is the idea that the storm hasn't always been there. Well, that part is definitely true, Alaki said. Probably. Without looking, Betu knew that all eyes had turned on the portly merchant. What? We travel everywhere, and everywhere people tell stories. I just happen to have heard some of those stories, is all. In the ensuing silence, every puff sounded thoughtful. By now, Betu had finished eating. He sat on the edge of the encampment, his back to the merchants. His eyes wandered from the stars above towards the rocky edge of the wilderness, where clouds gathered around the endless storm. But his ears were locked to the conversation around the campfire, which drifted along with his thoughts. This was the first time he had considered that the storm wasn't permanent. Surely, someone said behind him, these were just tales? Maybe they weren't, Alaki protested. People in distant regions had other names for and stories about the Plateau. Old stories. And some of the oldest didn't mention any storms. Just the usual cast of morality-deprived characters with the Plateau as a backdrop in their adventures. The most remarkable thing about those stories, Alaki insisted, was simply how unremarkable the Plateau appeared in them. So it went back and forth until a lull informed Betu that his benefactors were preparing to fall asleep. By then, he had an idea. He approached them for the second time that night. This time, he simply asked to travel with them until he could earn provisions for a trip of his own. In the crevice on the plateau, Betu shivered again. He was not miserable, but he was uncomfortable. Some of his provisions had been rendered useless by the storm, particularly the cloak he had acquired for protection from rain. Ah well, he shrugged. It would be a lighter trip up from here. He silently blessed the merchants again for their generosity and assessed what things would leave the crevice with him. Likely only fruit, since the dried meats would be unappetizingly rehydrated by now. He even considered discarding the leather greaves and wrist guards, but thought against it. They had made the climbing easier and would continue to do so until they fell off him. Or he fell off the cliff, Betu thought grimly. He gathered what made sense and inched his way out of the rocky hollow.